Hi everyone, welcome to class today. We are talking today about language loss and revitalization as our second sort of overarching concept regarding Alaska Native peoples today. And the subtitle of this lecture is Words and Worlds. And part of what I'm trying to get at there is the fact that words are more than words. Languages are more than language. Our language is not just a way that we get a set of ideas from ourselves to another person. It's not just sort of um, the specific way that one culture has decided to package the same ideas, and just each culture has a different word for it. Instead, we know from years of research and also from years of amazing indigenous scholarship that different language systems convey sometimes entirely different worlds, concepts that don't make the fullest amount of sense unless they're said in their native language. Social relations, ceremonial activities, things that are only properly actualized through their native language. So there's a lot more to language than just saying stuff, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Or at least there's a lot more to language than just what can be sort of contained in a dictionary. So we're going to be talking a little bit about language today, and this is going to be probably on the shorter side as far as the lecture. I have just a few kind of thoughts I want to share with you that sort of build off what you read about this week. So most of what I'm going to be sharing today is more supplementary to what you read, and then at the end we're going to kind of circle back around to the readings. All right, so a little bit of kind of context here. When you think about the human language tapestry, right? This rich diversity of different ways that human beings have developed to use our brains and to use our communicative processes. It's really rather amazing. We have 6,000 to 7,000 different languages that we have identified across the world. That is just crazy. That is so many. And not only that, but we could further kind of describe that as saying that it falls into about 150 language families. So a language family, if you're not familiar with the term, we talked about this during the Athabaskan lecture, but a language family is a group of languages that are, and this is going to totally surprise you, given the title of a language family. A language family is a group of languages that are related to each other. And so what we basically mean is several different languages descended from one language. That doesn't mean that there wasn't other stuff going on, like other languages that mixed in, but we can kind of look at 5 languages and say, well, they have a lot of similarities. They clearly came from kind of a root language. So, just like Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and so forth, all clearly have their primary roots in Latin. In similar vein, you can look at Dena'ina and Tanana and Tanacross and Gwich'in and say, despite their differences, these languages all clearly have roots in some kind of what we would call Proto-Athabaskan. So we don't, that language doesn't exist anymore, just like Latin as a living language doesn't exist anymore, but clearly there was some kind of root language that then evolved into all these different languages. That doesn't make them the same language, just like Italian and Spanish aren't the same language, but there's enough commonalities that we can tell that they're related to each other. So anyways, there's 150, give or take, distinct language families across the world, and several language isolates as well, such as Haida, so languages that don't, strictly speaking, fit into any language family. So, that's a bunch of linguistic nerd stuff that you can use to impress your friends and family next time you talk to them over Zoom. But the point I'm trying to make there is just there's a really rich diversity to human language, and that's amazing. It didn't have to be that diverse, but we made it that diverse, right? And it's one of the most critical elements of humanity that makes us different, I would argue, than non-human animals, is the richness with which we can communicate. All right, well, that's the diversity of human language. At the same time, it's kind of a chunky diversity. That's a weird way to say it. I already regret saying it that way, but it's like a diversity that's lumped in certain ways, in the sense that although there are about 6,000 different languages, some of them have way more speakers than others, and some of them are very, very, very small. So this is kind of a map of where we currently sit, give or take, as far as the most commonly spoken languages. The ones in red, that doesn't mean anything. I know it looks ominous. I don't have anything in particular against Russian, French, and Japanese. It's just because the red numbers come from a different data set than the white numbers. But the most spoken language, it's not going to shock anybody, is Mandarin Chinese. It's 1.1 billion people, but nipping right at its heels, this may surprise you, is English at just about 1 billion people. Spanish, about 500 million. Hindi and Bengali, I kind of put them together since they're both prominent in India. 0.38 billion, 0.26 billion, or about a half a billion together. Arabic, 0.27 billion, so quite a lot. Portuguese, and so forth. If you look at that list, I want you to look at it and kind of stare at it for a second. Stare at it. Stare at it like a weirdo. Stare at it until you're uncomfortable. Stare deep into its eyes. What you're probably realizing, I want you to think a little bit, what do these languages have in common? And what you'll probably realize is that all of these languages are associated with powerful empires, historically speaking, or even to the present day, or nations that have colonized large parts of the rest of the world, or groups of people who brought other groups of people into their empire, which points to one of the reasons why these human languages are so common, which is that they are what we would call trade languages, meaning that they are the languages in which much of the world's business and commerce, in terms of global commerce, has been done. A lot of our multinational corporations are doing business in things like English or Mandarin Chinese or Portuguese or Russian. We would also say that not all of these, but most of them are also colonial languages in the sense that they were at one point or another imposed on other groups of people either by force or by choice, either by direct conquest or by the sense that this other group is now powerful in this area, so we need to be able to speak the language to interact with these people who now have claimed sovereignty over us, and therefore we have to speak in their language. So coercion, right? So the trend over time, if you kind of rewind yourself all the way back to the beginning of human history, you would kind of see it as... I'll take care of that. Sorry to have interrupted the lecture. I was arguing with my amazing wife over who was going to do the dishes. Now, what you think the argument was I was trying to get out of the doing the dishes, but I was actually trying to do the dishes. So, what can I say? I'm a goat, as the kids are liking to say. All right. So, anyways, yeah. So the general trend over time, if you think of it historically, is we start out with very few, or perhaps even one, but probably very few languages. We diversified into many, up till we got into, 6,000 to 7,000. And then since that time, there's been a winnowing to where at this point we're losing languages every year, getting fewer and fewer languages. And so the general trend has been, of course, not that people just lose their language and stop talking, but instead that people are migrating to these so-called trade languages. And in fact, that is a very dramatic trend that has accelerated rapidly in the past century. And linguists estimate that by 2100, so 80 years from now, we could lose as many as 50% of the languages. So as many as 3,000 to 3,500 of those 6,000 to 7,000 languages will very possibly be gone by 2100. So I want you to think about that. I want you to hold that in your mind for a minute. Probably when you think about, issues in our world today. And I don't want to add to the issues in the world today because I know we got a lot. And as college students, you often, I think, spend a little bit too much time thinking about all the crazy stuff going on in our world. But, when you think about, hey, big picture issues, you probably don't think about language loss, unless maybe you're from a community that's particularly hard hit by it. But I want you to think about, if I was to tell you, hey, by 2100, 80 years from now, your lifetime, very possibly, 50% of the animal species will be gone. Just gone. That would blow your mind. At least I hope that would blow your mind if you're any sort of a person that cares about, animals or whatever. And yet this language loss is going on, and it's often kind of invisibilized. It's not something that sort of makes a lot of headlines, you don't typically hear political candidates talking about it or something. So it's a big concern, and it's a big concern particularly for Native communities, which are often some of the groups most hardly hit. As we'll talk about in a minute, Alaska Native communities have been profoundly affected by language loss, and we'll talk about that in a moment. First, though, let's get some basic terminology down to make sure we're all speaking the same language, pun intended. A few phrases that are useful from linguistics and linguistic anthropology, but just kind of good terms to have in the back of your mind as we're talking in case I use them. Language shift. So the idea there is languages don't disappear overnight, typically. Instead, what very often happens, especially if somebody's not actively sort of, physically harming people for speaking their language, but instead you just sort of have things like, oh, well, the school system is encouraging them to speak in a language, or the job industry is encouraging them to speak in a trade language, then you tend to get what we call language shift, which is as people gradually shift, or maybe not so gradually shift from one language to another. You can see that in a lot of different ways. You can see that as people start potentially doing more and more code switching, but actually probably more so what you see is people using it primarily with members of their own community, or maybe people mainly using it with older people in their community, and then the younger people start to use the native language, or sorry, the trade language amongst themselves. So anyways, language shift. An endangered language is a language that's facing severe declines and could become extinct, just like an endangered animal. Same idea, except for in this case, it's an endangered language. And then I want to distinguish between language death and language extinction. It's a subtle but actually very important distinction. So dead language, we use that to refer to a language which is no longer a native language for a group of people. So Latin's a really good example of that. There are people who can speak Latin. I dare say there are probably people who can speak fluent Latin. It is not a native language for any group of people. To my knowledge, there is not a group of people in this world who is raised speaking Latin. It is a dead language. Because if you think about it, that is where it is best and easiest to learn a language, is in the home, and when people are children, and when their brains are still so flexible and still so able to pick up language. That's not the only place one can pick up a language by any stretch of the imagination, but it's arguably the best place, and the best place to learn it as well is in a community of learners, a village or a town where everybody's kind of speaking that language. So a language really kind of becomes dead when there's no longer a language community attached to it. There may be individuals, again with Latin, picking it up, but when there's no longer sort of a vibrant community attached to it. Extinct language is more severe in some ways than what a dead language means, and it's kind of a different connotation. It means a language where there are no speakers anymore, or at least no fluent or active speakers. So Latin is dead, but it's not extinct. But there are native languages which are dead in the sense that people still pick them up or do some things with them, but there's no sort of community still actively practicing it. There's also native languages which are just straight up extinct, okay? Like there's no longer any fluent speakers. We had that happen recently with EAC here in Alaska, and there are still people that speak some EAC, but as far as like a fluent speaker. So yeah, that's a very severe situation when that happens. That can convey, it doesn't always convey, but it can convey that we may have even lost significant parts of the language if that was never properly recorded before the last fluent speaker passed. That can often mean that we've lost the information. Just like if something goes extinct in an ecological sense, we lose something extremely valuable. A couple other terms I want you to be familiar with are language maintenance and language revitalization. So when groups are starting to notice a language shift or even a language endangerment, there can be different ways to respond. Language maintenance is when you try to stop the decline in the first place, or I should say to prevent the decline in the first place. So for example, when Sequoyah, who was a famous Cherokee elder and intellectual, when he noticed his group of people becoming steadily assimilated into American society, he developed what's called the Cherokee syllabary, which is what you saw in that stop sign a minute ago. So it's a written language for Cherokee. Cherokee didn't originally have a written language. It was developed after Europeans had already started invading their lands. But he used it in part for Cherokee people to have more sense of pride and identity in the face of colonialism, and also as a way of sort of keeping the native spoken language alive by giving it a written version of it. So that would be an example of language maintenance, before the language is even declining, kind of actively doing things to keep it healthy. Language revitalization is after there has been a significant decline, to halt that and try to bring it back. So language revitalization can mean things like an immersion preschool where people learn Haida, which is in the reading something they were talking about doing, or a Head Start program where kids learn Haida. Or, here at Kenai Peninsula College for UAA, we teach Dena'ina classes among other language classes, Ahtna classes sometimes as well. And so this is kind of what I'm talking about there, about halting and reversing a decline in language, bringing it back.